The night of September 3, 1851, in Charleston, South Carolina, screams echoed from the Whitmore plantation that would be remembered for generations. But these weren't the usual screams of enslaved people being punished. These were the screams of the master himself, Thomas Whitmore, as he watched his wife do something that would shatter every rule of Southern society. What Catherine Whitmore did that night wasn't just scandalous. It was calculated revenge for 15 years of humiliation, cruelty, and a secret so dark that when it finally came to light, it would destroy one of Charleston's most powerful families from the inside out. This is the story of a plantation mistress who weaponized the very system her husband used to oppress others. A woman who turned slavery's power dynamics upside down in the most shocking way possible. And a revenge so devastating that Charleston's elite would spend decades trying to erase it from history. What you're about to hear actually happened. The evidence survived in private letters, court records sealed for over a century, and testimony from enslaved people who witnessed everything. This isn't fiction. This is the buried truth of Catherine Whitmore's revenge. Charleston, South Carolina, spring 1836. Catherine Monroe was 17 years old when she met Thomas Whitmore at a spring ball hosted by her father, one of Charleston's wealthiest cotton merchants. She was beautiful by the standards of the time, pale skin, blonde hair, delicate features that Southern society prized above all else. She had been educated in everything a plantation wife needed to know: managing household slaves, maintaining social appearances, producing heirs. Thomas Whitmore was 32, 15 years her senior. He owned Whitmore Hall, a plantation of 800 acres with over 60 enslaved workers. He was handsome in a cold way, with sharp features and eyes that never quite smiled even when his mouth did. He was also one of the most eligible bachelors in Charleston society. Their courtship lasted exactly 3 months. Catherine's father arranged everything. The marriage would merge two fortunes, two families, two empires built on cotton and human suffering. What Catherine wanted never entered the equation. In 1836, South Carolina, daughters were assets to be invested, not people with choices. They married in June 1836 in a ceremony that Charleston society would talk about for years. 200 guests. A dress imported from Paris. A reception that lasted 3 days. Catherine smiled through all of it, playing her role perfectly, not knowing that her new husband harbored secrets that would turn her life into a nightmare. The first 6 months of marriage seemed normal by plantation standards. Thomas was distant but polite. He managed the plantation's business while Catherine managed the household slaves. They attended church on Sundays, hosted dinners for Charleston's elite, maintained the facade of a perfect Southern marriage. But Catherine began noticing things. Thomas disappeared for hours in the evenings, claiming he was inspecting the fields. He kept the slave quarters off limits to her, saying plantation business was no concern for ladies. And sometimes, late at night, she heard sounds from the direction of the quarters that made her stomach turn. It was Miriam, the house cook who had worked at Whitmore Hall for 20 years, who finally told Catherine the truth. One afternoon in December, while Thomas was in Charleston on business, Miriam found Catherine crying in the library. The young wife had just discovered she was pregnant, and Thomas had shown no interest when she told him that morning. He had simply nodded and returned to his ledgers. "Mrs.," Miriam said quietly, closing the library door, "you crying because you're having a baby? Or you crying because you know something ain't right in this house?" Catherine looked up, startled. Enslaved people weren't supposed to speak so directly to their owners. "I don't know what you mean." Miriam sat down across from her, an act of boldness that could have gotten her whipped. "I'm going to tell you something, because you seem like you got kindness in you, and I don't want to watch it die like it did in the last mistress." "The last mistress?" "Master Thomas's first wife, Miss Elizabeth. She died 10 years ago. The doctor said it was fever, but those of us in the quarters, we knew different." Catherine's hands trembled. "What are you saying?" "Master Thomas, he don't like women, missus. Not the way a husband should. He got other interests. Interests he keeps in the slave quarters." The words hung in the air like poison. "I don't understand." "The young men, missus. The strong ones that work the fields. Master Thomas, he visits them at night. Been doing it for years. Miss Elizabeth found out. Tried to stop it. Tried to tell her family. He kept her locked in this house for 2 years until she died. Shame and loneliness killed her just as sure as any fever." Catherine felt the room spinning. "That's not possible. Thomas is a respected man. He's an elder at the church. He's careful. Real careful. Only takes the ones who got no family, the ones nobody would believe if they told, and he makes sure they know what happens if they refuse." Miriam's voice dropped to a whisper. "There's a boy out there now, Samuel, 16 years old. Master bought him 6 months ago. That boy's back, got scars that ain't from field work." Catherine stood abruptly. "Get out. How dare you speak about my husband this way?" Miriam rose slowly. "Yes, missus, but when you're ready to see the truth, You look at how your husband watches the field hands during morning roll call. You look at which ones he keeps back for extra duties. And you ask yourself why he married you at all when he never once looked at you the way he looks at them. That night, Catherine couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Thomas's coldness, his lack of interest in their marriage bed, the way he had dismissed her pregnancy news. And she remembered something from their wedding night, how he had barely touched her, had finished quickly without looking at her face, had seemed relieved when it was over. Over the following weeks, Catherine watched, and she saw exactly what Miriam had described. She saw how Thomas's eyes followed certain young men during morning assignments. She saw him keep back a field hand named Jacob for inventory work that lasted hours. She saw the bruises on Samuel's wrists, the way the boy flinched when Thomas walked past, and one night in January 1837, Catherine followed her husband when he left their bedroom at midnight. She watched from the shadows as Thomas walked to the slave quarters. She watched him enter a cabin at the far end. She crept close enough to hear voices through the wooden walls. "Please, master, I'm tired. I worked all day. You'll do what I say. You're my property. Please." The sound of a slap. A cry of pain. Then silence except for sounds that made Catherine press her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. She returned to the main house and vomited in the garden. Everything Miriam had said was true. Her husband wasn't interested in women. He had married her for appearance, for social standing, for an heir to inherit his plantation. But his actual desires were focused on the young men he owned, men who couldn't refuse him without risking death. Catherine was trapped. In 1837, South Carolina, divorce was nearly impossible, especially for women. If she left, her father would force her back. Scandal would destroy both families. If she spoke publicly about what Thomas was doing, no one would believe her. Southern gentlemen didn't commit such acts, or so society pretended. And even if they believed her, Thomas's crimes against enslaved people weren't crimes at all in the eyes of the law. Enslaved people had no protection from their owners' abuses, sexual or otherwise. She was 18 years old, pregnant, and married to a monster who would never love her because he was incapable of it. That's when Catherine began planning something that would take 14 years to execute. A revenge so complete, so devastating, that it would destroy Thomas Whitmore in every way a man could be destroyed. But first, she had to survive. And learn. And wait. The years between 1837 and 1851 transformed Catherine from a naive girl into something far more dangerous. A woman who understood exactly how power worked on a plantation, and who was willing to use that power in ways no one expected. She gave birth to a daughter, Margaret, in July 1837. Thomas showed no interest in the baby. He had wanted a son, and when Catherine suggested they try again, he made it clear that performing his marital duties was a chore he intended to minimize. Catherine learned to read Thomas's patterns. He would spend 2 or 3 nights a week in the slave quarters, always with different young men, always late at night when he thought everyone was asleep. He was careful never to show favoritism that might draw attention. The young men he used were rotated regularly, sold off before anyone could notice patterns. But Catherine noticed everything, and she began doing something that would prove crucial to her eventual revenge. She befriended the enslaved people of Whitmore Hall. It started with small kindnesses. She secretly taught several house slaves to read, a crime in South Carolina, but one she committed anyway. She arranged for medical care when people were sick, going against Thomas's orders to let weak ones die off. She listened to their stories, learned their names, treated them as human beings rather than property. This wasn't pure altruism. Catherine was building loyalty. She was creating a network of people who would eventually help her destroy her husband. But it was also genuine. Living with Thomas's cruelty had made her see slavery's evil in ways her privileged upbringing had hidden. 1845, Catherine had been married 9 years. She was 26 years old and had given up any hope of love or happiness. Her daughter Margaret was 8, being raised by house slaves while Thomas ignored her existence. Catherine's father had died, leaving her without family support. She was trapped completely. Then something changed. Thomas purchased 2 new field hands at the Charleston slave market. Brothers named Marcus and James, both in their early 20s, both strong and healthy. Thomas's eyes had lingered on them during the purchase in a way Catherine recognized immediately. "Those 2 are mine," Thomas told his overseer. "They don't work Sundays. I have special duties for them." Catherine knew exactly what those special duties were, and this time she decided to act. She began visiting the slave quarters herself, ostensibly to check on sick workers. She brought food, medicine, and most importantly, she brought conversation. She spoke to Marcus and James, learned their stories. They had been separated from their mother 2 years ago, had tried to run once and been caught, had been sold multiple times to different plantations. "The master," Catherine said carefully one evening, speaking to Marcus while pretending to treat a cut on his arm, "has he visited you at night?" Marcus's eyes widened with fear. Enslaved people who spoke about such things to the master's wife could be killed. You can speak honestly, Catherine said. I know what my husband is. I know what he does. Marcus studied her face for a long moment. Finally he nodded. 3 times. He says if I refuse, he'll sell my brother south where I'll never see him again. And if you comply, he says nothing, just leaves after. I feel like I'm not human after, like I'm just a thing he uses. Catherine's hands trembled as she finished wrapping his arm. What if I told you there's a way to make him stop? A way to punish him for what he's done? Missus, there ain't no way. He owns us. He can do whatever he wants, not if we're careful. Not if we work together. Catherine's voice was cold with determination. My husband has humiliated me for 9 years. He's violated you and dozens like you. I want him to suffer like he's made us suffer. And I have a plan. Over the next 6 years, Catherine carefully executed that plan. She continued building relationships with the enslaved people on the plantation. She documented Thomas's abuse in a secret diary, recording dates, name, details that would be devastating if they ever became public. She befriended other plantation wives, gathering information about their husbands' secrets, building leverage. And most importantly, she waited for the perfect moment. The moment when her revenge would be most devastating, most public, most complete. That moment came in September 1851. Thomas was hosting a gathering of Charleston's elite plantation owners, politicians, church leaders, 20 men who represented the pinnacle of Southern society, all gathered at Whitmore Hall to discuss politics and drink expensive whiskey. It was supposed to be a demonstration of Thomas's status, his power, his respectability. Catherine had other plans. On the afternoon before the gathering, she told Thomas she was feeling ill and would retire early. He barely acknowledged her, too focused on preparations for impressing his guests. This was exactly what Catherine wanted. That evening, as Thomas entertained his friends in the main parlor, Catherine put her plan into motion. She had arranged for Miriam to serve the men drinks heavily laced with laudanum, not enough to make them unconscious, but enough to make them slow, confused, unable to react quickly. Around midnight, when the men were deep in their drugged stupor, Catherine made her entrance. But she wasn't alone. She walked into the parlor dressed in clothing that would have scandalized any Southern lady, a simple cotton dress like enslaved women wore, her hair loose, her feet bare. And behind her walked Marcus and James, the 2 field hands Thomas had been abusing for 6 years. Gentlemen, Catherine said, her voice cutting through the confused murmurs. My husband has been keeping secrets from you. Tonight, you're going to learn the truth about Thomas Whitmore. Thomas lurched to his feet, his face pale. Catherine, what are you doing? Go back to your room. Sit down, Thomas. Catherine's voice was ice. For 15 years, you've humiliated me. You married me as a costume, a prop in your respectable gentleman act. Well, you spent your nights raping enslaved men. Tonight, everyone learns what you really are. The parlor erupted in confused shouts, but the laudanum kept the men slow, sluggish. Before Thomas could react, Marcus and James had grabbed him, forcing him back into his chair. What you're about to witness, Catherine continued, is justice. For years, Thomas has used his power over enslaved people to satisfy his desires. He's violated dozens of young men, threatened them with torture and sale if they refused. Tonight, the power dynamic reverses. She turned to Marcus and James. You don't have to do this if you don't want to, but if you choose to, I promise you'll be free after tonight. I have papers prepared. You'll go north with money and documents. Marcus looked at Thomas, at the man who had violated him countless times, who had treated him as property, as a thing to be used. Then he looked at Catherine. I choose this, Marcus said, for me. For my brother. For every man he's hurt. What happened next was Catherine's complete revenge. She made Thomas watch as she and the 2 men he had abused enacted a reversal of power so complete that it shattered every rule of plantation society. She was intimate with both Marcus and James publicly in front of Charleston's elite, while Thomas was forced to watch, held in his chair by men who finally had power over him instead of the reverse. But Catherine's revenge went deeper than just the sexual humiliation. As Thomas watched, she spoke, her voice steady and cold. Every time you raped these men, you told yourself it was your right. They were your property. You could do whatever you wanted. Now, watch me exercise that same right. Watch me treat your property the way you've treated them. Feel what it's like to be powerless. The men in the parlor watched in horror, too drugged to move, too shocked to process what they were seeing. The mistress of the plantation, the woman who should have been the model of Southern womanhood, was destroying every social rule they held sacred. When it was over, Catherine stood in the center of the room, completely calm. Thomas Whitmore is a fraud, she said to the assembled men. He's spent 15 years violating enslaved people, while pretending to be a respectable gentleman. I have documentation of every abuse, names, dates, details. If any of you speak about what happened here tonight, I'll release those documents publicly. Your friend Thomas will be exposed as what he really is." She turned to Thomas, who sat in his chair, tears streaming down his face, utterly destroyed. "You wanted to make me powerless. You wanted to use people as things. Now you know what that feels like. And you'll live with this for the rest of your life." Catherine walked out of the parlor. Behind her, she left Chaos Charleston's elite in shock, Thomas sobbing, and Market and James finally free with papers that would allow them to travel north. The aftermath of that night destroyed Thomas Whitmore completely. None of the men who witnessed it ever spoke publicly. Catherine's threat to release her documentation kept them silent. But rumors spread through Charleston's elite circles. Whispers about what had happened at Whitmore Hall, about Thomas's true nature, about Catherine's revenge. Thomas became a pariah overnight. Former friends avoided him. Business partners ended their relationships. The church asked him to step down as elder. Within 6 months, he was a ghost in Charleston society. Catherine filed for divorce, an almost unheard of action for a Southern woman, but she had leveraged the threat of public scandal, kept Thomas from fighting it. She took her daughter and moved to Philadelphia, where she spent the rest of her life working with abolitionists, using her first-hand knowledge of slavery's horrors to fuel the anti-slavery movement. Thomas lived another 12 years, isolated and broken. He sold Whitmore Hall in 1853 and moved to a small house in the countryside. He never remarried, never recovered his social standing. He died alone in 1863, just as the Civil War was tearing apart the society he had once been part of. Marcus and James made it north, changed their names, and disappeared into free black communities where they could finally live without fear. Their descendants would never know the full story of how their ancestors gained freedom. Catherine's revenge became legend, whispered about in Charleston parlors for generations, but the full truth was buried, deemed too scandalous, too dangerous to the image of Southern gentility. The story was sanitized, turned into vague rumors about a fallen woman and a disgraced plantation owner. But Catherine's secret diary survived. It was discovered in 1923 in a Philadelphia archive, and even then, it was kept sealed for decades. Not until the 1990s did historians gain full access to her account, the detailed documentation of Thomas's abuses, her careful planning, her unflinching description of the revenge she enacted. This is buried truths, where we refuse to let these stories disappear. Catherine Whitmore's story isn't about heroism or villainy, it's about power, about the ways people trapped in evil systems find ways to fight back, and about revenge that destroys as much as it liberates. Subscribe so these voices keep reaching people who need to hear them. Comment below, was Catherine's revenge justified? Did using enslaved people as part of her revenge make her as bad as Thomas? What would you have done in her position? Until next week, keep digging for truth.